Thank you very much. Actually, this is sort of coming full circle, as probably my first involvement in any woman's group was with our student chapter of AMWA when I was a medical student 50 years ago, or actually longer than 50 years ago. So I certainly was not a feminist. I was born in 1941, just at the beginning of World War II, and I grew up in a little town called Denver, New York. This is actually a picture of Denver, New York, and it is indeed one building. It had a population of 82, and I went on to go to Roxbury Central School, where I graduated in 1958 with a class of 16, mostly women. And so, to me, I really didn't know of any of the issues of feminism or any of the concerns of women. And in 1958, when I graduated from high school, a woman's image was that if she had a career, it would be as a secretary, a teacher, or a nurse. Those were the jobs that were available and were really high stakes for women and pretty impressive. And women were not encouraged to go to college, and if they were, they went there usually to get an MRS, to select the best of the male candidates. And so it was very different. Nobody talked about women's rights or women's equity or anything that was related to women. And I certainly am one of the senior women, but I would prefer to say that I'm vintage AMWA. And as you know, vintage can be good or it can turn to vinegar, so you have to be a little bit careful. But the majority of women really were not in the public eye, and my only really woman role model was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a very impressive woman, and still in today's sense would be a very, very impressive woman, but we didn't see other women. And I was really oblivious. And oblivion was good in certain ways. I knew I wanted to be a doctor. People would always tell me, oh, you want to be a nurse. No, I don't want to be a nurse. I know the difference between a doctor and a nurse, and I want to be a doctor. I got very good grades, so I thought I would be competitive to go to school. And I really had no idea that medical schools had quotas for women and that they were usually 5%. And even with the knowledge that I did gain of that, I applied to medical school anyway, and I got into medical school, so I thought that was okay. But we were treated differently as medical students, as women. There were just very few of us, and there was no concern about treating you in a judgmental way. You were hit on by the professors. You actually had experiments done on you that were uncomfortable. I remember one of our physiology experiments where everybody was given Pitocin, but it was contaminated with oxytocin, which didn't bother the men but gave women bad cramps, and they knew it, and they still did it. And so there were a lot of things that were unfair, and I must admit that I chose to ignore them. And then I decided I wanted to be a surgeon, and that was in 1965. And I wanted to be a surgeon because I thought they were fabulous doctors. I found it fun. I loved to operate on people. And so I thought that this would be a good career for me. I didn't realize that women weren't surgeons, even though I didn't know one. I really hadn't known many women physicians, and I had made it, so why couldn't I be a surgeon? And this is the curve for women surgeons from 1981 to 2009. Now remember, I started out in 1965. That goes back on that bottom line to almost below zero. And in all the data, it was either not applicable or not sufficient numbers or whatever. There was no one who was considered a woman surgeon. And so I set out on my career. So how did I survive? Well, my applications were returned from every surgical internship that I applied to. But that didn't faze me. I made a deal with our chairman of surgery that I would do mixed medicine and surgery, and if I didn't still want to be an internist, and if I'd done well enough as a surgical intern, he would actually accept me in the pyramidal program, where I had to compete with 11 other people for the 4 spots at the top of the pyramid. And again, I thought I could probably do that, not realizing that there were no rules and that you could be thrown out because they didn't like the color of your dress that day. So there was a problem, but I made it through that. And at the end of my residency, no one offered me a job. I had been a very good resident. I'd accomplished a number of things as a resident, But the people in private practices, quote unquote, my wife is worried about having you as a partner. Like, what am I going to do, to him? But anyway, that was a problem. And so I actually created my own job by getting a job in the VA hospital, getting some of my medical colleagues to collaborate with me in research and help me learn to do research. And so I was in that position and was recruited then to the faculty of the medical school. And when I got my position on the faculty, it was really to do a lot of the scut work of the department, but that was okay. I liked the medical students, I liked the place, and so I decided I would do that. But I was starting to get annoyed by a lot of this, I must admit. And so I started to become a little bit more proactive. And just as this was going on, really the second wave of feminism occurred. The first wave of feminism was with the suffragettes, and really women hadn't gotten the right to vote even that much before I was born. So this was not really something that I had considered or looked into. And when Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, I must admit I missed it. I was a medical student, I was busy, I wasn't concerned about it, so I didn't have a clue. And NOW was founded in 1966. I was a surgical resident. Again, I was busy. I didn't pay much attention to it. But we happened to have one of the early leaders in NOW in my community. And quite honestly, if anything, I would always be in conflict with her because most of the things that NOW advocated in those days, I had no interest in. I didn't want to sit in McSorley's bar and have a beer. I didn't want to burn my bra. I really thought the girls needed a little support, so I had no interest in that. So I ignored a lot of this, but I regularly faced discrimination in my job, in my career, in many, many things. But I fought back as an individual and felt that I had always done that pretty successfully and I could continue to do that. And then shortly after I finished my residency, Title IX of the Education Act in 1972 really made it unfair for any facility that accepted federal funds to discriminate against women. And wow, did this change things. I mean, I couldn't believe it. In 1 year, we went from having 3 or 4 women medical students per class to having 15, 17, 20 out of a class of 100. It was amazing. But you know what? Even though this dramatically increased the number of women, it really didn't do anything to change the way they were treated, how they were received, or them going into leadership positions. But I certainly steadily became aware of gender bias, and I do like the term bias, and I still use it. It puts people on edge, but I think that's good sometimes. I was always confronted about these misconceptions about women. Women aren't strong enough, women quit to have kids, women don't work. I mean, all of the women in my family had worked. They had worked very hard. My mother was a waitress. She worked harder than I have ever worked any day of my life. But, consider women didn't work hard. And I was repeatedly told that I couldn't do things because I was a woman. And I really didn't know anything that I couldn't do because I was a woman, but there were things men couldn't do because they were men. I never saw one have a child. So I would point that out sometimes, and they'd get a little bit annoyed. And I was really tired of being treated inappropriately. It went beyond sexual harassment. As women surgical residents in those days, we were sexually abused, not only harassed. We were not promoted with our male colleagues. We were denied access to places, and we used to have a lot of our institutional dinners at this club that did not allow women to walk in the front door during the day. So you had to walk up the back stairs. The first time the dean had me have to walk up the back stairs, he realized it would never happen again. So you did get annoyed by these things. I was certainly paid significantly less than the men who had no better training and were not doing any more work. As a matter of fact, most of them were doing less. They seemed to always manage to go sail in the afternoon. I didn't even have lunch, and it got to the point sometimes that I didn't even take potty breaks. And you were always assigned the less desirable jobs. You served on committees where you got no academic credit for them, and you just worked. And I really was tired of that. And then enlightenment happened. I saw this advertisement for the first Women in Academia project, which was co-sponsored by AMWA and the AAMC. As a matter of fact, Janet Bickle was one of the major instigators for that, and I believe it was in 1981. And I wasn't accepted to go to that program, but again, being my typical self, I called up Marlise Whitty, who was the PI in Tucson, Arizona. I said, Marlise, how come that I was not accepted in this program? You know, here I am, and how wonderful I am, and you should accept me. And she said, well, quite honestly, she said, you're a surgeon. And we didn't feel that we could invest our very few spots in helping a woman surgeon develop, because you're never going to get anywhere. And I thought, okay. So I made a deal, again, with Dr. Whitty, that if I paid for my own room and board, I could come to the meeting, and I got my dean to pay for me to go. And it was really the thing that changed my activity relative to a woman in medicine. It was okay to me that as the only woman surgeon I was discriminated against, but how can you treat the pediatricians that way? I mean, I just couldn't believe that women in all specialties were treated so poorly. Women pathologists who had these unbelievable credentials who were really not promoted or supported appropriately. And I realized that if we were going to change behavior as we agreed at that meeting, we had to work together, because it wasn't going to happen if just one of us or just one specialty did this. It was so depressing at one point that 3 or 4 of us actually went and sat on a rock in the middle of the desert. But we got over that, and we realized that there were actually a number of enlightened men who would help us, and that we needed a plan, and we needed data, and we needed to move forward. At that meeting, we actually each promised that we would go home and do 2 things, one on a local level and one on a national level, to improve the status of women. So at my own institution, I started the Women's Caucus, which was a group that really presented the data on gender to the dean and to the faculty. We actually investigated the promotion process, which we realized was totally unfair and clandestine, and that no women were on the committee. We nominated women for committees, and we really made our concerns known to the dean and known to the department chairs and the faculty. And in many ways, I was willing to be the sacrificial lamb for that. This still exists in my institution. It's called the President's Advisory Committee on Women's Issues, or PACWI. So it's a long-standing, successful program that points out women's problems. And nationally, I didn't know any women surgeons, so I thought, how can I do anything to benefit women surgeons if I don't know any? So taking a typical woman's approach to this, I actually put up a sign and invited any women who were there to join me for breakfast. And I got a room, and we had breakfast, and there were about 20 women who actually came to that breakfast in 1982. And the organization has since become a formal organization, and I had it intentionally at the American College of Surgeons because I felt if women were going to succeed in surgery, they needed to be part of the mainstream of surgery, and they needed to succeed in organizations that are of surgeons. And actually, the reason I am only at the meeting today is that the American Surgical Association, which is the most prestigious surgical organization in the world, had its first woman president this year, Anna Ledgerwood from Detroit. And so I had to go, and I had to support Anna, and it was just a wonderful, wonderful thing. And actually, several years ago, we started having women's surgeons breakfast there. And as recently as 5 years ago, there were very few women at the women's surgeons breakfast. We didn't even fill one table. And at this year's breakfast, there were 50 women, all of whom are successful women academic surgeons and very well established. So you could do things, but you know, there is a learning curve to it. And the first thing that you learned was you just do it. And it usually worked. Very few people would challenge you when it was done. They'd sometimes say, well, who told you you could do that? And I'd usually say, well, nobody, I just did it, you know? And sometimes you really needed to be audacious. I went to the Women in Medicine program of AMWA in the early 80s that was put on by Lila Wallace, absolutely fabulous lady. And she presented the pelvic teaching model program, where women actually volunteered to have medical students do pelvic exams on them, give them feedback, et cetera. I thought this is a great program. So I went back, I got the dean to agree that we could have this. I got one of the OBGYN people to help me train these women and to supervise the course. And after a couple of years, these women wanted a raise. They thought they weren't getting paid enough. Dean told me that was not going to happen, that they should be happy that they were having this experience, and so I had a bake sale outside the dean's office. I got the women to bring in stuff. They were from a large women's group, and you know what? I never had to ask him for money for that program again. So you really need to figure out how to do things, and you need to garner support for your programs, both in men and women, and you really must be careful never to male bash. You know, I had no women mentors. I had all male mentors, and if it hadn't been for men, I would not be standing here. And actually throughout my career, that's been very important. And so you really need to figure out how to enlist their support. And the most important thing is to see if they have a mother, a wife, or a sister who is a professional person, and also if their only children are daughters. They are absolutely committed to women's issues, and they will be very helpful to you. You need to make sure that you're actively involved in your projects and that you have the time to do them, and you need to be very consistent in the message. It became known very quickly in the American College of Surgeons that if anybody got up on a podium and said anything negative about a woman, I would be the first to stand and to challenge them and to contradict them. And many people called me the conscience of the American College of Surgeons when it came to women. And so you could do that. And I learned through these things to be an advocate. Effective advocacy is not easy, and to be a feminist, you really need to be an effective advocate. And you need moral courage to do that. You can't be afraid for yourself. I don't know exactly how I learned that, but I learned that many of the things that I did, if you did them for the right reason, and you were doing the right thing, and if you allowed people to save face, you could do it, and you wouldn't have a problem. Then I also, fairly early in my career, had a chairman who used to fire me every month. And actually, he didn't have the right to do that, and I would just tell him that, which annoyed the life out of him. And the dean liked me better than him, so that was a positive thing. And I'd been there longer, and I think the dean thought it would not be good to uproot me, so I got support. Finally, I had my lawyer write him a letter and tell him that he couldn't do that anymore, and it worked out. But you have to not be afraid for yourself. You have to not be afraid of the consequences to yourself. You also have to be very sure of the data. One of the fights I used to always have with the now women in Syracuse was they didn't have the data right for women in medicine. They were talking about women not getting into medical school. That wasn't the problem anymore. They got in, they just weren't treated well. So you need to know the data. And you need to keep and report the data. So every year you need to keep track of the women in your organization. We used to, at the American College of Surgeons, have a group of women from the Association of Women Surgeons who would count how many women were podium presenters as opposed to how many women had submitted material to the forum, which is sort of open. And we would let them know, and we would let them know that they were way behind. And I would always bring up the point that they didn't have diversity on their committees in either age, gender, or race. And it started making them very nervous. So they did that a lot better. So you really need to do those things, and you need to make people aware of their unconscious bias by showing them when their behavior shows their bias, which is clear when you don't see diversity. And you need to nominate worthy women. Olga Jonassen, who was the pioneer American woman surgeon who really did not believe in supporting women's issues for many, many years of her career, ultimately did. And we used to meet at the American Surgical and have a list of worthy women who we wanted to nominate. And we continue that list, and that list exists so that we get women into good places. You also need to use the feminine in pronoun and talk about she does this and she did that and it's her contribution, etc. And know the gender of the people who are presenting and doing things so you can do that. And also make sure that you treat women respectfully by calling them by their professional title. I get really annoyed when people get up at a meeting and they introduce Amy, but they always introduce Dr. John whatever. It's not appropriate. You are a doctor. You should be addressed as a doctor in any professional setting, and you should demand that. And you need to be nice. Being nice doesn't mean being condescending or being sappy. It means that you need to be respectful, that you need to give people the opportunity to express their side of an issue and make sure that you always are polite and not use profanity, etc. And you need to recruit men to support your cause. And when you do this and you have a plan, you can really make progress, and you need to report on that progress and show the difference. I think it is important to understand bias and to realize that we're all biased. And if we don't recognize this, we sometimes can't move forward. And you're just as biased if you do not respect the man who stays home to take care of the family as you are if you don't respect a woman who doesn't choose to do the work that you choose to do. And more companies, when they're hiring people for administrative leadership positions, will have them do the Harvard implicit bias study, which will point out your areas of bias. And you have to make sure that you fight back about the things that are commonly said about women. And the reason women are overlooked, that they don't want that kind of job, that they're really not interested in it, they don't want to be a chairman, they don't want to be a surgeon. They're too busy, you know. Gosh, she's got 5 kids and 7 dogs and a house and whatever, and a needy husband, and so how can she have the time to do that? Well, you know, just ask her, and if she wants to do it, she'll do it. And, oh, I didn't think about her. Yeah, she would be a great candidate. So make sure you always have at the tip of your tongue a list of worthy women for any possible position. One of the better reports, I think, on a lot of the issues of women in academia anyway, is the American Association of University Women's report in 2010, Why So Few? Because it points out the barriers to women in universities, which I hate to say are really the same for women in academia and in medicine and in medical schools for that matter. They're less likely to be included in informal and formal social gatherings. They're not part of the basketball team. They're not invited to play golf with the professor, although we had one woman who was a ranked tennis player, and the chair of surgery loved to have her play tennis with him because she'd let him win. So you never know. But anyway, they're less likely to be included in collaborative research. They don't have mentors, and they're not given advice about navigating the workplace. And that was the first thing that the Association for Women Surgeons decided to do, was to learn the rules of how you get into organizations, how you get on committees, and how you can go forward. And they reported a lot of issues, and one of them that I think that is the most interesting is that they were sick of dysfunctional departments. They thought the leadership of their department was not very good. They were tired of all of the nonsense that they went on, and so they decided that they were going to leave and go into something else rather than put up with this nonsense. And I think that that's very true, and I think that it's very important to insist on good leadership in your department, and these are things that can be done through evaluation and through the support of the institution. One thing that hasn't necessarily resolved is the family penalty, and I don't think Google's suggestion of storing your eggs is really the right way to go about it, I gotta believe. And it's important that women be able to marry and have children during the time of their life when they are most likely to be fertile and when it's more important for them to have children and raise families. And in that respect, I think you have to look at every opportunity that comes your way to facilitate this. As the women of our medical school, we actually started the first in-hospital daycare center in an academic institution. And most of us didn't have children, and that was part of the reason, so we started that. When I was chair of the American Board of Surgery, if you were a woman and you became pregnant during your residency, you had to make that time up at the end if you took any time off. So you could take your vacation, which was was 2 weeks at the time, and have a child, or you could make up the time at the end. And we had a discussion, and it was one of the funniest I've ever heard in my life, of a group of men deciding how many children you should have in 5 years. The answer was 2. That you could have 2. That was reasonable. And so now the American Board of Surgery and the RRC in surgery allows you to have 6 weeks off in your first 3 years or in your last 2 years for childbearing, and you do not have to make that time up. And there are some guidelines to suggest how you can make it safest for yourself to have a pregnancy. So you need to look at these, and we need to work about these. And we saw that there is bias and advancement there, and this report gives it hasn't changed a lot since my beginnings, and I graduated now 50 years ago. And you still see that women aren't treated equally in getting grant support. I actually had the experience of submitting a grant to the NIH that was turned down. The next year, the chair of that study section submitted the same grant, almost verbatim, and it was accepted. So there's a lot, and you have to pay attention. You have to really report back when those bad things happen. So I've learned that you can overcome bias. You have to maintain your standards. You can never sink to the low level of some of these other people. And you really need to be creative about your solutions and not get discouraged. And you have to be happy. If you look miserable all the time, nobody's going to want to do what you do. And my feeling, and I always told them, was bias was their problem. When they would tell me that they really had difficulty with women being surgeons, I would look at them and say, the only men that I know who have difficulty with women being surgeons are men who are insecure. And that ended that. So, you have to have the line. And so I'll be a feminist. I'll be a feminist as long as there are problems with professional women and high-achieving women having trouble in their careers because of parenting issues. When women are underrepresented in all positions, until they're represented equally, I'll have problems. I'll have problems until women are consistently paid equally and until gender bias no longer exists. And so I'm afraid that I will be a feminist until I die. And my wish today is that each of you, in some aspect of your life, look at where there are problems for women and work to change that. Each success will empower you, and you will see that you can achieve these things, and you can change the world. Thank you.